Welcome to Agile Clips, where we break down Agile into manageable pieces. In this show, we discuss documentation. Teams new to Agile often underestimate the need for it. We talk about what kinds of documentation are still needed and why, and provide some tips for ensuring that there is just the right amount of documentation and that it provides value without being a burden. Hey Santosh, how are you?
I'm doing well. Hope everything is back to normal on your side.
Yes, everything's fine, thank you. That said, we did have some personnel changes where I work, and in the process we found some documentation gaps that will definitely cause us some challenges. So I thought that today we could discuss documentation in an agile world.
Yeah, I think that is always a misconception, or ton of questions come our way always about the documentation.
Right, and I think partly that's because people look at the Agile Manifesto, which says we've come to value working software over comprehensive documentation, but they seem to ignore the next statement, which is, while there is value in the items on the right, we value the items on the left more.
Yeah, and I think also that every word in that statement counts. It's like working software over comprehensive. That means
Right.
it does not need to be tons and tons of useless documentation. It never says no documentation. It says comprehend.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Product owners and the engineering teams usually communicate, of course, in meetings and during backlog refinement, but ultimately everything tends to go into epics and stories. But those are really not good forms of documentation when you think about the early phases of setting up a project where you need to communicate with stakeholders and you need to really capture market requirements. And so to do that, you really still need some kind of MRD or PRD, not quite on the scale that it would have been produced in the waterfall world, but you still need some kind of presentation or some document that captures the essence of why you're building the software.
Yeah, and I think that documentation is what is the basis for the dialogue that follows, because that's when the iteratively teams and the product owners and the stakeholders communicate saying, oh, this is what I meant, or this is what this specific thing is, because they start with the high level and then they decompose into the smaller epics or sub-epics or stories. So yeah, there is a trail of documentation, and has to be also like a traceability as to every user story that you're building. There has to be trace up to the portfolio or theme or initiative or feature, why you're building that, and the documentation behind that is going to provide that linkage.
That's right. And along the same lines, one good technique for communicating with all stakeholders as well as the teams is to do something like a product box or a press release before you write any software. And the idea is to really capture in a very succinct way what the product is about. Right. And once you have that, it really allows people to focus on what's important and what's not important. And by the way, if you can't get your stakeholders to agree on something that short, for sure they're not going to agree or even understand all the details that you might put into a longer document.
Right. And I think it gets lost in translation, basically. That's the challenge. And what I see is the type of documentation has changed, but the purpose of the documentation has not.
Correct. What would be some other examples that you can think of important documentation?
I think if you look at the very basic things, the framework like technical architecture. So suppose there are some guidelines as to what type of architecture or vertical stack that has been technology stack is being used, that needs to be communicated across all the teams so that they know what is the size of the sandbox they are playing. And that is essential for that point of view. I think the other one that always comes to my mind is the user research and the UX design, as what was, like, if they have done A/B testing or focus groups, or how the UX templates are being built for certain type of interchanges or the design. So that needs to be communicated. The software design doesn't go away, because you have to have a design review. Even for the story, you need to get a design review of the story. So it's like the smaller component. The only thing that we are changing here also is a smaller size, so that you are not reading tons and tons of software design document. And if you can embed that into your user story body itself, that makes it even better. So there is a place, and that's where we are seeing where the documentation needs are coming. Yeah, I mean, is there anything else you want to add?
Well, you just brought back horrible memories of sitting in meetings with 20, 30 people reviewing a huge software design, or actually even requirements documents, where I'm sure half the people had no idea what was going on. They were half asleep, bored, multitasking. So, really, it's the idea of just doing enough to communicate what's important. And it's really, the communication shouldn't be through the document. It should be through the human interaction to reach that common understanding.
Exactly.
But the documentation facilitates it and then provides a record afterwards.
Yeah, and I think, you brought up a good point that, usually the documentation is, for example, the team makes some decisions based upon whatever that, is like, oh yeah, we'll use this type of software architecture, or we will limit only these use cases. If that is the case, somewhere it has to be written as to why we are limiting this, or what was that decision being made, and the rationale behind that. So then, as you said, posterity point of view, as to 6 months from now, somebody looks at it as to why the heck did they do that? That thing is right there, either in the user story or at the higher level. But that's what the documentation means. It is the backbone of certain decisions and limitations and architectures and those kind of things.
Yeah, and actually, you just also reminded me of another thing that happened to me when I was a product owner. I had a very clear vision in my mind of how a series of stories would lead to the desired outcome. And each story was really a different case of a common piece of functionality. So to me, it was all clear. But I realized that the engineers that were working on the stories didn't obviously know what was coming next. So they just saw, if this condition happens, then do this, this, and that. And then in the next sprint, if this condition happens, do this, this, and that. And so then when I realized there was a problem, I created, it was literally a one-page document that put everything into context, and that problem just went away because, yes, all the stories were modular, but people could refer to that one page and get the big picture.
Right, exactly. And I think the other thing that helps is we always talk about a definition of done. So basically, how does a team know when they are done? And if it is documented from that point of view as to what kind of end results are expected in a succinct way, then it makes a lot more easier for team to think about, even breaking up to the task level, what they need to do. So it's essential to have some kind of a guidance or the explanation, but that should trigger the dialogue, not in lieu of dialogue.
Mm-hmm. And definitely other examples would be test cases, test plans, things that are actually quite long-lived and especially need to be repeated over and over again. I mean, hopefully a team automates as much as possible, but still very often when some functionality is new, in a lot of teams, it's not realistic, unfortunately, to get everything automated within that sprint.
Right.
And maybe although we don't like it, the reality is in many organizations you might have a offshore test team. And when that happens, you definitely need documentation that they can follow.
Right. And the other thing also is that the bugs are found. You need to adjust the test cases because of the maybe the way the test cases were constructed, some bugs slip through that. So you need to document that as to why these test cases had to be modified, so that going forward, you know how that has been, all the technical debt has been addressed. So there is a full circle there, and that's like a part of the feedback loop into the test case and plans. So yeah, there is the trace of how those things are being implemented, or the decisions have been made to how to address those test cases, their plans, and those kind of things.
Absolutely.
And the other thing that I always see is that when you have the cross-functional teams, especially the deployment team comes at the last, and if they don't have the old conventional, I mean, it's just still there. It's like even if you are using Jenkins or whatever those tools are, you still need some details about how that thing is being plugged in, and those have to be handed over to them. Or, I mean, in an ideal world, there could be a vertically stacked team where those team members are part of it. But even in that case, they need to have some kind of a document, and there could be a template that they may be using, but that's where a common exchange sits, and that's a minimal documentation need for deployment, is especially the CIC, continuous integration and continuous deployment, the components of DevOps, where developers and operations work together.
Yeah, and related to that, just the processes themselves, not only the content of each release and how certain functionality needs to be deployed, but just overall processes also need to be documented, because in certain organizations the process is very important and has to be repeatable and maybe audited and so on. So you need to have processes documented as well.
Right. And I mean, the typical example of that is like you need to have the working agreements documented as to how this whole group is going to work, the definition of done, that kind of those things are irrespective of what type of organization you have. That's the common ground, and those things are needed from organization to even function.
Right. With those things in mind, one thing that excites me personally is when I see just a very pragmatic approach to documentations, which could even be just pictures taken with a phone of a whiteboard and just put into a document. One of the things that really drives me nuts is documents that have about 4 pages of introduction before you get to any meet, with all the revision controls and people who have to sign off. And I think, again, it depends on the industry that you're in and the organization, but in many cases, that's where I feel that documentation can be just unnecessarily verbose.
The sign of extra documentation means that the dialogue is not happening. And I've been into so many places that they say, "Oh, just send me an email." I'm like, no, don't. The emails don't do talking. Emails create email hell. So it's like, it is kind of, I mean, you can always summarize in email what we talked about, but email is not the answer. Treat it as a documentation.
Yeah, so here's a tip. When you write documentation, think about who your customer is, who's going to read it. Mm-hmm. And then make sure that you get feedback from your customer regarding the documentation, and is it sufficient, and is it okay if we keep improving it over time. And again, it's all about making sure that people really understand the content. The documentation just provides a record. It should not be the mechanism for communication, because we know that it cannot be trusted for that.
Right.
You really need to get immediate feedback from somebody saying back to you what they understood, so you can verify that they understood it correctly. And then you can put it in documentation, or that documentation might have already existed, but you go through it and make sure it's complete together. And again, you don't want to spend more time on documentation than you have to. So the sooner everybody's in agreement, there's an understanding, and the key aspects have been documented, you just move on.
Funny you should mention this, because I've seen somewhere, one of the clients that we had, we actually looked at how the structure of a documentation should read like. And one of the things, the top lines were audience for this documentation, intended audience for this documentation. And that made things a lot more easier, because people in that group or that role said, oh, I better read this because this is something that is going to help my job to get it done. And that made a huge difference. And that actually started changing the thinking of people, saying, who am I writing this for? And then it filtered unnecessary jargon or anything of that nature.
I think that might be a good point to end on.
Yeah. No, I think this is great. I think we covered a lot of areas, and I'd love to hear back from our audience as to what kind of documentation challenges they have seen and how did they overcome that.
Definitely. All right. Thanks, Santosh, and thanks
Thank you.
everyone.
All right. Thank you.